Welcome to the Mets Pod. On today's show, we talk Pete Alonso because we always talk Pete Alonso on the Mets Pod and the exhausting negotiations going on between him and the team. We also talk about the infield maybe being complete with the addition of Nick Madrigal, and of course, the question of Jose Iglesias will be back. And as always, we answer your mailbag questions after we go down on the farm to talk Kevin Parada. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And Joe, another week rolls on. We still don't have an update of the latest with Pete Alonso, or I guess there is no update. And I'll tell you right now, I will be flying home from New Orleans late on Friday. That is when Pete Alonso will sign with the Mets, just to ruin our chances at an emergency pod. How are you, my friend?
Doing great, and that sounds like exactly how this is going to pan out.
Yeah, the timing, it just makes too much sense. This all ends. We've only sat here waiting and waiting month after month. We've done a live show. We have another one planned down in spring training for the opener. And it'll happen when somehow the only time both of us aren't available. But of course, we will react accordingly. And of course, please subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your shows. If you'd like to drop us a review, drop us a mailbag question with that review. You'll hear a lot of mailbag questions answered on today's show. You can watch us on YouTube, another place in the comment section that you can leave questions there as well. Some quick business items here. If you missed it, we're very thankful. The Mets Pod took home the gold for Best Baseball Podcast at the Sports Podcast Awards. Thank you so much to everybody. I know we've been almost to the point of being obnoxious, begging you to vote, but you all listened and came through, and you are a part of this, and we really, really appreciate everybody that supports this show. It was an awesome feeling for all of us involved with the show to take home gold. So thank you for your support. It means the world. And some good news on the heels of that. The good news keeps on rolling. In spring training, as I teased before, the Mets Pod will be in Port St. Lucie. It's a live show February 22nd. Of course, that is before the first spring training game at Clover Park this year. We'll be set up right outside the main gate. So if you're at the show last year, not a lot changes. But if you're coming to the show this year, we're right outside the main gate. You can't miss us with our tent. The show will start at 11 a.m. Please stop by, hang out. We're going to have a special guest that we are going to reveal very, very soon. That guest will be revealed next week, to be precise. We got giveaways. We just gave away 2 Cadillac Club tickets, by the way, at our Amazing Day show. So we have some really good giveaways lined up. She'll be broadcast on SNY's YouTube channel. If you can't be there, all SNY's social platforms. It'll be a regular podcast in the feed, so subscribe. You'll never miss any of the podcasts that we do that are off schedule. But if you're at the game, stop by. It's 11 a.m. Saturday, February 22nd. Right outside the main entrance of Clover Park. The atmosphere is going to be phenomenal. Joe, I cannot wait to get down to Port St. Lucie again. Our live show last year was electric. I think it was the most animated. Some of the people asking questions have been, and I know you're just as excited as me.
Oh, I can't wait. And that game, I'm going to go on a limb and assume Juan Soto is going to be in the lineup for the first spring training game. And it's just crazy to think we will be right outside the gate at 11, and at 1 o'clock, go inside and watch Juan Soto take his first officially unofficial, because it's spring training, but his first actual at bat as a New York Met. And yeah, I can't wait.
Yeah, it's going to be electric. I mean, there's no doubt about that. It's funny how much changes in a year. I remember a year ago when you and I were at spring training, we were sitting right behind home plate to watch Edwin Diaz throw for the first time since his big injury. And that felt like a big moment. Now the big moment is, hey, we get to see Juan Soto wearing a Mets uniform playing in, sure, it might not count in the standings, but it's still a real game. So the other lingering question is, if on February 22nd at Clover Park, will Pete Alonso be wearing a Met uniform and taking his usual ground balls at first base and his usual batting practice and even playing in spring training games? Joe, I don't even know where to go with this one anymore. It just feels like, although you often use the quote that deadlines make deals, and we do have a bit of a landmark finally in these negotiations that this team will be reporting to Port St. Lucie before you know it. And Pete Alonso will have to make a decision. Do I want to ride this thing out and stay home and see if the deal comes that, I've been waiting on? Or do I want this all to be behind me because I love the game and I'm okay with what's out there and I just got to get into a camp, especially the camp I know where a lot of Mets are back to business trying to get over the hump of the NLCS last year. So, Joe, I think this is another landmark. I'm kind of fascinated to see if the Alonso side finally blinks because my gut feel is nobody wants to be home when teams are reporting, man.
Connor, as we established, Friday is when it's happening. So we don't have to wait all that much longer, right? You'll be flying home and it'll just be a whole situation. But I'll say this, Scott Boras has never had any fear in taking these contract negotiations into spring training. So while that reporting deadline and, players getting into camp and getting ready for the season is coming very fast. I mean, pitchers and catchers is less than a week away, and position players report shortly thereafter. But Scott Boras is not afraid to carry this into February. So I have no idea if we're going to wake up tomorrow and Pete Alonso will have signed a deal with the Mets or somebody else, or if we're going to be talking about this at our live show on February 22nd. I sure hope this is something I could come to a conclusion soon, because as we've said on this show a couple times now, it feels like they have the basic idea of a contract. Let's just get the structure together and let's make everybody happy here. I think Pete Alonso wants to be back with the Mets. I think the Mets want Pete Alonso back, as we mentioned, on their terms largely. But let's give a little bit on the Mets side. Let's give a little bit on Pete and Boris's side, and let's wrap this thing up and close out what could go down as one of the best Mets off seasons of our lives as a fan.
Yeah, it's something that we haven't discussed because there's been this huge, to be continued on it with Pete being out there. But the reality is, if Pete's back in whatever capacity that is, a 3-year deal with an opt out, a 2-year deal with no opt outs, whatever it may be, the reality is you're right, Joe. I mean, you get Juan Soto, you bring back Sean Manaea, if you bring back Pete Alonso, you add Minter to the bullpen. Like, you've made a lot of significant moves. Even the quieter tier 3 and 4 moves, trading for Jose Siri to be a platoon in center field, of course. It would be an exclamation point on the entire thing. Just think the expectation turns to, even with the Dodgers, everybody's least favorite franchise in sports right now, even with the Dodgers out there, you go into a season with expectations to try to win a championship. And I think that's pretty rare as a fan, honestly. I understand there's certain fan bases that's all they're used to, but that you could kind of count those on one hand in the 4 major sports. For a lot of the common fan out there to sit there and go, we're going into the year and we think this team should win the World Series or can win the World Series or is top 5 and most likely to make it or win the World Series. Like, that's a special feeling as a fan. And I think if you kind of close the door and get this one done with Pete, that I don't think there would be it would be hard for fans to find that thing they constantly point to, you know what I mean, on Twitter, like, Stearns needs to get this or needs to get that. And fans always find a way to do that. But It feels like, Joe, those would start to really, really dwindle if Pete's back.
There's always going to be something. He didn't do enough in the rotation. They could use another high-impact reliever.
It's going to be Jose Iglesias.
Yeah, there's Iglesias. They're still not as good as the Dodgers. There will always be a complaint of some kind. But one thing I want to point out, Mike Petriello at MLB.com put out an article today of all the teams in baseball. The Mets have added the most 2025 expected WAR to their roster for the 2025 season. So that includes everything the Dodgers did, everything the Yankees did. Of course, that's heavily spearheaded by, I think it was 6.5, something like that. So Soto was obviously a huge chunk of it, but that's why he got 765.
That's the point.
Yeah, that's why you sign a guy like that. But the moral of the story is the Mets have had a very strong offseason. And as you said, they have the opportunity here to put that true exclamation point. And Pete Alonso, dropping him into the cleanup spot, and you see Lindor, Soto, Vientos, Alonso, Nimmo, Alvarez, and then you get to the bottom where there's Jesse Winker and Starling Marte at DH and Jeff McNeil, and then the center field platoon of Jose Siri and Tyrone Taylor, and you're talking about a very legitimate lineup to compete with any team in especially when you're talking about in a short series. Even that Dodgers rotation, I think this is a lineup that could compete with it.
Yeah, I think so too. And you just talk about the length of the lineup. I mean, it's crazy to think about it like that. And you're not even, projecting a huge jump from Alvarez like we saw from
Right.
Vientos last year, right? You get one of those and it completely changes
Yeah.
everything. And
Brandon Nimmo kind of regains the form that he's had
that's a good
previously.
one too. Yeah.
Like
Hey,
like the
Pete
lineup could
Alonso
be
was back
right.
and he's the Pete Alonso from, 3 years ago, not the guy that's in the last 2 years.
And
Cause you
and
never know.
even the last 2 years of Pete, they have been down certainly by his standards.
Right.
But, in 2024, it was the clutch stats that I think that really got him. But, hitting 240 something, I think he hit around 240 something, hit 34 homers or whatever he did this past year. Like, if you just drop a 250, 35 home run bat into the lineup, that obviously is a big impact when you add a guy like Juan Soto on top of already having Francisco Lindor and already having Brandon Nimmo and these guys that can impact the baseball.
So, Joe, we kind of hinted at that Iglesias would be the next guy if they sign Pete that people would be clamoring for. Obviously, a fan favorite for all the right reasons. Coinciding with that is that the Mets did add Nick Madrigal, who is fascinating to me, and I'm excited to ask you about him, Joe. Not from the fact of I'm sitting here and going, "Oh man, like this is the upside move of the offseason, and this is the move I've been asking for." Not like that, but because his story, Joe, this was somebody in 2018 out of college, Oregon State specifically, which obviously puts a ton of great position players into the league, was the fourth round pick of the draft. And
Fourth
now,
overall. Fourth
I mean, fourth
overall.
overall
Yeah.
pick in the draft is what I
Yeah.
meant. The fourth overall pick in the draft. And now, I mean, he's already, and this was, of course, by the White Sox, but now he's already, out there after it didn't work with the White Sox, it didn't work with the Cubs. What happened with this guy, Joe? And he's obviously a major leaguer. Obviously, he gets, he's still getting chances and stuff like that. But it feels rare to me to see somebody that was a top 5 pick, and it wasn't that long ago, and the green light still hasn't come on for him. And I know he's got, speed and some defense, but what is the story with Madrigal?
He just hasn't shown the ability to really impact the baseball. So there's not really much extra base hit ability, not even counting just home runs. It's good bat the ball skills. He's not striking out. So that's one thing. He is when he goes up there, striking out is not going to be a big part of his game. He puts the ball in play. His career batting average, for those who care about batting average, is still over 270. So I think this is an opportunity for the Mets to see what happens with Iglesias' market. As Andy Martino on Mets Hot Stove on Tuesday night, he said that Jose Iglesias is seeking a multi-year deal. And Madrigal is an interesting combination of, if he's your backup infielder, you're not too upset about it, but it's a split contract. He has a minor league option remaining. So if Jose Iglesias ends up coming back and being willing to sign a 1-year deal for a reasonable sum of money, and the Mets decide bringing him back is the right move, Madrigal can go to AAA. So I think that's just an added benefit to this move. But this is a David Stearns kind of classic kind of move. If I know people don't want to hear this, but everyone would be maybe raving about this move if David Stearns was with the Milwaukee Brewers still. It's just like, oh, buying low on a former top 5 pick that just hasn't quite figured it out. I think he has the opportunity to be that backup utility infielder that we spoke about on the show last week and prevent using, maybe one of the younger guys in that role. And if Jose Iglesias and the Mets do end up working something out, Madrigal could just be depth in AAA.
I like your call out that it is insurance with the way the deal is structured, because say Iglesias, and that's a good nugget from Andy. Iglesias says, you know what, like at this stage of my career, my age, I've learned what it's like to be on the outside looking into the major leagues, and it was a long road back, and I want to go to a place that values me, and I'll take the 1-year deal. But if that reality doesn't, arrive, then yeah, you have a guy that's younger, should be fine defensively, and is a
Yeah.
flyer, and like you said, Joe, has the option to go to the minor leagues as well. So Stearns is a guy that prioritizes depth above all else. I mean, he's added 1 million arms, and the reality is a couple of them are going to pop in spring training and people will start talking about them. But when those arms are signed in November and December, the Mets pod cares. But
Yeah.
the actual overall publicity of those signings isn't that crazy. So this is kind of just what he does in the operation the Mets have, and with the amount of injuries in the sport or guys that perform below expectations, above expectations, it's just worth stockpiling depth. You're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, Joe, let's go down on the farm, and then we got a ton of mailbag questions I want to get to that cover a wide range of topics, which is why we kept the open a little tighter today, because we'd rather get to what is on everyone's minds. Let's do a little status report on Kevin Parada here, Joe. Once upon a time, not that long ago, a first-round pick of the Mets, a early first-round pick of the Mets. And, Joe, I think we knew with Parada, him being this long-term answer at catcher was always a little bit of a long shot, but the bat was always supposed to play. What's gone on with Parada? I know it's been injuries at times but what you saw from him last year and kind of where he stands going into the season, where he's gotten passed by a lot of guys in this system, both international signings and recent draft picks.
Yeah, unfortunately, Kevin Parada has not been able to put it all together with any level of consistency. He'll have stretches where it's like, all right, here's a couple weeks where he just smacking the ball around. And then it'll be 5 weeks of him not hitting. And behind the plate, receiving needs a lot of work. Throwing runners out did take a slight step forward this past year, but his step forward is still not quite good enough. To me, I'm looking at this as a bit of a make or break year for a guy that the Mets, as you said, took with the 11th overall pick, which was the compensatory pick they got for not signing Kumar Rocker after everything that transpired after they drafted him. And there was super high expectations within the Mets, within the scouting circles. And, for me personally, for whatever that's worth, I had Kevin Parada very high on my prospect list for quite a while. And he is on the verge, if 2025, where I would guess he starts back with AA Binghamton and gets the chance to kind of rehabilitate his value there. If it doesn't pan out, this is a guy that could go from at one time being in my top, I think 3 or 4 in the system to potentially falling out of the top 30 entirely.
Yeah, it's really disappointing. And Parada was somebody, we ran into at spring training last year. It felt like in 2023, a lot of it was just bad luck health-wise, where you're expecting a big bounce back following that. And he hasn't been able to put it all together. Hopefully this is finally the year, maybe get a little positive momentum in AA, Joe, that he can carry into AAA at some point. But we got to wait and see where it goes for him, because when he got into this system, that was a time where I think, especially, both pitching and position players, honestly, it felt like, Joe, the Mets lacked the high-end talent, like the names that you always circle and go, man, like we're going to be following him really closely until he's in the major leagues. And now they've added so many guys over the years with picks, international signings, and trades. Let's not forget, obviously, Clifford, Gilbert, and Acuna were all in one deadline. And he's just been passed by, and it's kind of double-sided, right, Joe? Because it's one side of it is it's good that the Mets have some depth and a lot of new names, and they've really restocked the system. But there's no doubt he's just fallen so far below expectations so far, and it's kind of a put up or shut up year for Parada.
He's still young enough to turn it around, and I know that he has been dismissed entirely, and I am maybe a little more patient than others because I know the time and everything that it takes to really develop it, especially at a position like catcher. I think we often look at what Francisco Alvarez did and think that is the norm of some kind, when that is a bit of an anomaly. So I'm willing to give Parada one more shot, but he needs to find a way to, one, stay on the field, and when he's on the field, just be a little bit more consistent day in and day out at the plate.
All right, let's jump into the mailbag. The first question is a 5-star review from the _tone23. Thank you for that. What do you guys think the Mets ultimately do with Jose Butto? If he needs 2 to 3 days rest between bullpen outings, then I feel like it's not worth it to have him in the pen, and he should just prepare to be starting pitcher depth. So, Joe, I actually disagree here with the point. I don't obviously think it's crazy or anything, but I think, to be fair to Jose Butto, the Mets like him as a multi-inning weapon, and that's why he traditionally needs more rest. And yes, there might be a world after a couple injuries that you would stretch him out again as a starter, but I think he's too good of an arm to just start in Syracuse as rotation depth, because that's the reality, right? You do the simple math: Manaea, Senga, Clay Holmes, Montas, and Peterson, and then you could really sit there and say like Blackburn and McGill would get a quick call as well after him,
And Griffin Canning.
and the great Griffin Canning, who we are big fans of on the Mets pod. I think there's a little recency bias amongst the fan base, and I get it. Like, Butto really ran out of gas at the end of the year, but there was a while, Joe, where when the Mets needed a 7th and 8th inning shutdown to bridge to Diaz, you'd look in the pen and you would pray that Butto could go that night for a long time. So I'm still excited about the idea of him as the new era Seth Lugo for the Mets that gives you 2 or 3 innings on any given night.
So one thing I'll say to what you said, Connor, he has no minor league options left, so you can't send him to AAA as depth.
Great point.
So he has to be on the roster one way or another.
It's a huge factor.
And the path right now, I think, is the bullpen makes the most sense. I think, to the point of the question, I am a little bit afraid of repeating the Seth Lugo situation where the Mets were like, he's too valuable bullpen. He's too valuable in the bullpen. And then he finally gets a chance to start when he leaves. And now he's in the top 3 in the Cy Young voting a couple of years after leaving the Mets. So I completely understand that point of view. But where they are right now, I think they are planning as if Butto's a member of the bullpen. And the hope is that was communicated properly heading into the offseason so he can start to plan his workouts and his regiments around the ability to pitch out of the pen a little more frequently, because it wasn't just exclusively those 2-inning outings, those 3-inning outings, and then he needed the break. If he threw 1 inning, he needed that same exact break because his body wasn't quite responding. But that sometimes comes with converting in season from starter to bullpen and trying to do it for an elongated period of time. Like, David Peterson went from the rotation to the bullpen for the playoffs, but that was a couple weeks stretch. So it's a little bit different. They needed Butto to do this for months at a time. So the hope on their side is that an offseason properly preparing and a spring training properly preparing will allow him to pitch maybe a little more frequently. Maybe it's not, every day, but maybe it's not 3 days off in between outings.
I'm with you. I think it's finding the sweet spot and getting him comfortable in a role. And I mean, the reality is he's very valuable to the Mets bullpen right now, where it's an all hands on deck situation for any valuable arm. All right, the next one from Scott Steffs, LGMAK. This is a YouTube question. Do you see a scenario where the Mets start Acuna at second if he has a great spring? So this is the ultimate domino effect, Joe, because if Pete Alonso is back, it's kind of easy to say Mark Vientos is going to play third. Pete Alonso is going to play first. A guy named Francisco Lindor is going to play shortstop. And then you could have a pretty narrow conversation about second base, which we will in just one moment. And I think that's the conversation to stick to. But if Pete is not back, at least at the start of spring training, and Vientos is playing first, and then you're looking at third base being really wide open, they're going to give Brett Beatty a big look. We'll see where Mauricio is at health-wise. We'll keep the conversation the way it has, that we think Pete will be back, because we have said on the Mets pod for many, many months that we think Pete will be back. I don't know if this is open for Acuna, Joe. I think it would take a really special spring for this to be in consideration. It just seems like the Mets are going forward with Jeff McNeil getting a lot of time at second base, and it would be really surprising to see them just go, you know what? We're moving on to Acuna, and Jeff, you're going to be totally off the bench. That's a scenario to me, Joe, that only happens if McNeil bombs out the first 2 months of the season and you just need something else from second base.
Yeah, barring an injury, Connor, I don't see the pathway for Luisangel Acuna being the starting second baseman to open the season. Now, to your point, if McNeil gets off to a very tough start and Acuna is in AAA Syracuse hitting, then that conversation is going to get louder and louder as the struggles happen up here and the success happens down here. I just don't see that pathway for Acuna to be the everyday guy. And as you mentioned, there still is that possibility that Pete Alonso departs the Mets. And if he does go to Toronto or the Angels or the Reds or whatever team we want to say, he goes somewhere that's not the Mets. You're going to have Vientos likely spending most of the time at first base, guy like Beatty at third base. Do you also want to bench a veteran like McNeil to put Acuna at second base? That to me is very risky, especially coming off of the heels of signing someone like Juan Soto. I think it makes sense to give Jeff McNeil the shot to start the season, and then, of course, be prepared to adjust as you go, whether that is an Acuna, whether that is someone like Jet Williams as we move throughout the season. The Mets are going to have some options, and Ronnie Mauricio, I think we'll talk about here in a minute. So that's another guy that can get some consideration. I think that ultimately is just putting pressure on McNeil to perform early.
Yeah, I think something that evaluators, front office staff, and coaches in the sport look at differently sometimes is they understand the floor with young players.
Yes.
I mean, Luisangel Acuna doesn't turn 23 until March. He was awesome when he came up last year. There's also a world where he starts off the season raging hot. And then there's a time in June where the OPS could be under 500 for a month. Young players, like they're volatile. They go through, they're learning on the fly. The jump through the minor leagues and then to the major leagues, the way guys adjust to you is just a totally different rate. So I think that is why maybe, to the chagrin sometimes of fans, veteran, whether it's coaches, once again, GMs, lean on veteran players is they think there's a floor there that they're comfortable with the team. They like knowing what's going to happen. And I think it doesn't mean the Mets aren't interested in Acuna long-term being a major part of this team. I'm sure they are. They're almost protecting him from himself at times as well with that, where it's, hey, if we don't have to throw a kid into this spot to be a savior, then so be it. Because how many times, Joe, do you see that strategy unfortunately not work out? We saw it 2 years ago with Francisco Alvarez and Brett Beatty once upon a time as well. And Mark Vientos wasn't really given a fair shake, but once again, he was not put into a position to succeed when he first got called up here.
If you go back to 2024, you just named a couple guys. Francisco Alvarez had such peaks and valleys, which is very standard for a young player. You had the other side of the coin. Mark Vientos was wildly consistent, which is why I think so many people believe that everything from 2024 is real and repeatable, because he did it consistently throughout the season from when he actually got the opportunity. And then when he went to the playoffs, he performed under the brightest lights humanly possible. So those are kind of the two ways it can work out. And I totally agree with you when it comes to the floor versus ceiling conversation. And when you look at a veteran player, I know McNeil is unfortunately someone that Mets fans kind of have the target on his back at this point. We hear about it all the time of people wanting to get rid of the guy. I think the Mets and teams believe someone like Jeff McNeil is less likely to have that elongated cold stretch where maybe it's a week or two rather than 4 weeks, 5 weeks that could happen to a younger player more likely.
All right, our next question. This is from CNYM Jets C on YouTube. Speaking of Francisco Alvarez, what does Francisco Alvarez need to do to take the next step at the plate? How likely is it he puts it together this year? So, Joe, I think with Alvarez, and I'm really curious your thoughts on what he needs to, manage at the plate, from a mechanics standpoint and approach standpoint and everything like that. I just thought last year he was somebody that lost his confidence once upon a time. And he is somebody that falls victim to trying to do too much, where it feels like certain moments he's like, I'm coming up here and I'm going to try to hit a home run, rather than when he's at his best. And we've seen some amazing at-bats like this. He goes up there and goes, I'm going to see what this guy is going to try to do to me, and I'm going to react that way. If that's drawing a walk, if that's shortening the swing and putting this in opposite field, if that is hitting a ball 600 miles an hour. So, and that's really hard for any young player, Joe, but I think he is the king of feeding off the moment for better or for worse.
He has a tendency to get over aggressive. I think that's a very, very fair way to put at it. And he will chase some of those breaking balls. As you said, he will feel the moment and be like, this is the time. He has the best tattooed on his throat. Like, he's like, this is the time to be the best. And when it works, you get that walk-off home run
Oh,
where
yeah.
he's point,
Orioles?
yeah, Orioles, I believe. Him and Winker, it was like back-to-back days, I believe. But if he can take his approach that at times is good and make that more consistent, I think the league is on notice. If Alvarez can control the strike zone a little better, which interestingly enough, he's improved the ability to control a pitching staff as a
Right.
defensive catcher, which is what no one thought he was going to be able to do. And now at the plate, if he could just find that happy medium, this is a guy that we could be talking about as a cleanup hitter, as an all-star, as one of the best offensive catchers in the sport. And one thing that I will say about him is there is not a harder worker in the room than him. He is relentless. He wants to be great. And at the ripe age, he's 23 now, I think, or is he still 22? I don't know.
He
I
turned
figure
23 at the end of November.
Okay, so he just turned 23. He is at a ripe age to take a massive step forward. And it's something we thought was going to happen in 2024, and it never came together. And, maybe that thumb injury had more of an impact than we thought it did, sapping his power a little bit. But if he could be healthy in 2025, I think Francisco Alvarez is primed for a massive year.
Yeah, he's somebody where you look at the range of outcomes and it's really hard to predict. I mean, he could be a superstar. He
Yeah.
can be below average offensively. I think the defensive floor is something you feel really good about. Like you said, the work ethic, the energy, those are things that you feel really, really good about. And Joe, I just wonder if with so much star power on this team right now, if there's a world where Alvarez is batting at the bottom of the lineup consistently and Lindor is leading off, and you know that after Alvarez as a pitcher, you're like, oh, great. I get to deal with Francisco Lindor, then Juan Soto, then Mark Vientos, maybe, on and on and on it
Right.
goes. That if they can get through to Alvarez and say, man, you're hitting last in our lineup, and after you is one of the best stretches of any lineup in the entire sport, you are going to see pitches because you are 22, 23 years old. They got to get you out. They can't say, yeah, you know what? I'll take my chances with Francisco Lindor and Juan Soto. So this is the optimism, like very optimistic side of me. And I've been very optimistic with Alvarez because I just believe he's the truth and it just is going to take time. But I think that's a situation, Joe, for a young player that if he can dial in a little bit and just change the approach to be a little bit more patient and not the hero, I mean, that's a spot to feast as a hitter.
And he is so strong, Connor, that he doesn't have to try to hit home runs. Some of the best home runs that I see from Alvarez, obviously the ones where he turns on an inside fastball and pulls it down the line 110, those are fun. But I love when he just sits back and lets the ball travel through the zone just a touch longer, and he just pokes it the other way, and it just on a line just gets over the wall for a home run. So he doesn't need to go all out to try to turn into some home run hitter. I think it naturally can come for him.
Yeah, and ironically, I just looked up his batting order positions from last year. I mean, he only had 24 plate appearances batting ninth. So it's not something they've really tried with him yet. So there's not really a sample size from that. He batted eighth a lot, but once again, then you have a ninth hitter behind you. Interestingly enough, when he batted fifth, which was only 42 plate appearances, his OPS was 948. So maybe he's a guy that just better hitters behind him. It kind of changes the pitches he sees. I know at times he likes to get very first pitch happy. Mm-hmm. I'm very, very fascinated to see the adjustments Alvarez makes this year. All right, Logan's 8286 on YouTube. Given the Pete predicament where fans / Scott Boras / GMs are arguing over his true value, who is the player on the roster this year that Mets fans are overvaluing or undervaluing the most in your opinion? Joe, I'll give you the floor for this one first. I definitely have my undervalued answer. I will marinate on my overvalued answer.
So I read this question when I sent it to our producer Jeff to put. No, this was in our rundown. This is from YouTube. But when I read it in the rundown, I read it as overvaluing and undervaluing, so I grabbed both.
Yeah,
I think in a way we talked about
that's what I was doing.
Luisangel Acuna, and there was a question about him being the second baseman. I wonder, is he someone that is being slightly overvalued by the fans right now? We know when he came up, when Lindor had the back injury, he was such an impactful player for those 2 weeks. And, the Mets, they may not make the playoffs if Acuna doesn't do that. So that's no ding on him. But ultimately, that's a very small sample size of success. And at the AAA level, Acuna had a 654 OPS. So what player is he? Is he the guy that came up when the lights were bright and he's just going to be a better major league hitter than he was at the AAA level, which does happen from time to time? Or was that a bit of a blip on the radar? So I think that's where I would go for the overvalued. And on the undervalued, I want to go to the bullpen and talk about Reed Garrett. I think he had a little bit of an up and down season, but ultimately 3.77 ERA, struck out 13 guys per 9, so elite strikeout numbers. The split finger was one of the better pitches in the sport. His ability to generate swing and misses there, and batters only hit 132 against it. He's got to work on his command a bit. The walks were a little high, and at times it was frustrating to see the walks, especially when we're talking about like the middle of the season where it felt like so many of these relievers were struggling to just get guys out. Garrett was issuing some walks. And his four-seam fastball is a pitch that he specifically said to SNY social posted it the other day down in Port St. Lucie. He's working on his four-seamer, and it's something that he didn't use a ton in 2024. Part of that is because hitters crushed it, but he's able to throw it in the upper 90s, touching 100 miles an hour. So if he could just work on, maybe a little grip change, maybe a little angle change where he could get a more efficient four-seam fastball, I think that could take him to the next level. And I think a lot of people are kind of just overlooking him when you're talking about the Mets bullpen. It's all about Edwin Diaz. It's all about Minter and Stanek. And we talked about Butto on this show. I think Garrett's a guy that's often forgotten about, but could be an impactful reliever in 2025.
It's a good call because Garrett was the classic guy that he went through the roller coaster where there was times where you're like, oh man, they're going to call Garrett in the most high leverage spot and we feel good about it. And then there was that long stretch where he just wasn't right. And I think with relievers, it is very easy to become emotional towards them. But when you walk away from the full sample size, Drew Smith was the king of this, by the way. And I understand people will think I'm crazy, but every time you walked away from a full season of Drew Smith or the full sample size of what he did in this season, you were like, Drew Smith was kind of an average 6th or 7th inning guy. But Mets fans remember some of the home runs he'd give up and like, Drew Smith's the worst reliever we've had in 10 years. Like it's just, it's such an uneven, because obviously the high leverage spot of the game or the timing you give up runs.
And they throw 50 to 60 innings a year. So it's just like, yes, you really remember each inning that didn't go so well.
Right. Exactly. So I've kind of been on this one for the entire offseason. I still think in the role he has now with this team, which is very unique to any role he'd have with the rest of the league, I still think Starling Marte is undervalued. I think that, one, he will hit lefties at a really high level. I think if he's not playing in the field a lot, he becomes a really viable base running threat, whether that is off the bench as a pinch runner or when you need to infuse speed into the lineup. He has not really slowed down on the bases. Number one, he has great baseball IQ as a base runner, which probably makes him look even faster than he actually is at this age. But I like Marte on this team, and I understand there was a lot of talks that the Mets were, considering moving his money off the books, and I think it's okay to look at a guy differently than when you got him. When the Mets got Marte, it was like, okay, this is our everyday right fielder. We obviously expect him to be a guy that can hit around 300. That first full year with the Mets, he had an OPS over 800, and he's going to be a big-time stolen base threat, and he's going to play a lot of baseball. And that was year 1 of the contract of a 4-year deal. Now it's year 4 of the contract, and Juan Soto's in town. Brandon Nimmo is extended. If Starling Marte is a kind of Swiss Army knife threat of your team where you could DH, he could pinch run. We don't really want him on the outfield too much off his legs because he's been hurt over the years, but he does add some kind of element to. He could stand out there with a glove.
Oh,
Is what we like to say.
He can play.
Right, he could play. Like that matters for a team that when you get one injury in the outfield and the answer is Starling Marte or the answer is a guy that's traveled across the league or Drew Gilbert that's not ready. Like I know the answer that I want. So I think Marte has become a complete afterthought with this team. He also had some really big moments in the postseason that people have just put out of their brain. The other day I was having one of those travel situations where I'm like, let me just go on YouTube and watch all the greatest Mets postseason moments of the last year. And you remember all like Pete's home run, Lindor's grand slam. You remember all of the obvious, but there's little hits that you completely forget where you're like, oh man, Starling Marte, had some really, really big moments. Obviously Winker had his moments. So I think that would be my move, Joe, because it's hard on this roster. And I like that you went with Reed Garrett because that's a name nobody would say. It's hard on this roster to find the undervalued guys because there's so many household names now on this team.
Yeah, they have not built up a roster of like no-name guys right now. No. It's when you're talking about Starling Marte, who is a $20 million a year outfielder on the contract that he earned, and you're like, hey, he's going to be really good as a pinch runner late in games. Like that right. shows the depth that David Stearns has built with this team and why they are a team that's considered for, deep in the playoffs, certainly a playoff contending roster.
Yeah, without a doubt. For overvalued, I really liked your Acuna take. I think it's, sometimes we anoint guys ready and it could be dangerous. So I align with you on that one. There's not really a lot of guys on this team that, because the fans are, either really high or really low on people. And I think that's a hard one to land on. All right, one last question for this week's episode of the Mets Pod. This is from Jason Russo. Is the bullpen set? Simple as that, Joe. I will be very surprised if they made a significant move. I think they like the amount of veteran arms they have. And we always say this on the Mets Pod. I really think Stearns likes going into a camp with a ton of volume and seeing which dart throw or two dart throws can actually stick out of Port St. Lucie.
I think they are done when it comes to guaranteed spots.
Right. Like the Stanek deal.
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing wrong with adding more competition, and you always want to have competition. What is really the point of having all these non-roster invites and these down roster 40-man relievers if you just get 7 guys during the offseason and say, well, this is our bullpen and that's the way it is, and those guys are just showing up to work for no true purpose, so to speak. But I look at it as Edwin Diaz, AJ Minter, Ryan Stanek, Reed Garrett, Dedniel Nunez, and Jose Butto kind of locked into spots. And then you have competition of does a guy like Griffin Canning compete for a swingman spot if he's not able to crack the rotation? Huáscar Brazoban, who we were both very high on when the Mets got him at the trade deadline. Sean Reed Foley, Danny Young, who had some moments for the Mets last year. Max Kranick, who we thought was going to do some really good things based on his performance in spring training last year. He's back on the 40-man roster. And then you have some of the non-roster guys that are not on the 40-man but got minor league deals with invites, and some of them with some big league experience, like Genesis Cabrera, who has had a fairly long career as a lefty reliever. Fireball guy like Anthony Goes. They have options, and you want, to your point, Connor, to be able to go to Port St. Lucie and get a look at all of these guys and have a true competition for the last spot or two in the bullpen. And I think that's kind of where they're at.
I'm with you. I think they just like leaving it open, and it gives them some flexibility throughout the year. It's just tough to go into a year with a bullpen and saying this is the guys, and it doesn't matter what they do in the spring. And just the flexibility that they have. And we saw all the guys they were able to get, some in creative ways, some just in straight up trades. So Stearns just likes that ability to constantly keep it moving and try different things. And, he's 1 for 1 already. So we'll see if he can go 2 for 2. This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. Remember to subscribe to the show, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review with the question, and we'll look for it for a future mailbag like the ones you heard today. And, of course, you can watch the show on SNY's YouTube channel. Become a subscriber over there as well. Joe and I cannot wait. February 22nd in Port St. Lucie at Clover Park for the spring training opener. We will be out front at 11 a.m. near the main gate. And one more thank you to everybody that voted for us as we took home gold for Best Baseball Podcast with the Sports Podcast Awards. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.